Okay? So when we're looking at the debate phase, again, we did this really quickly yesterday, but really what you see is the person that typically is leading going into the debates. What happens after the debates? What's the election results? The person leading tends to be the one that wins. What's my one exception? Bush and Gore in 2000. And it's largely, a lot of it has to do with just the closeness of that particular race as well, coming down to the contested ballots in Florida, all right? So what does that mean? Does it mean that the debates are kind of meaningless? If the debates have done little to change the trajectory of a race, are the debates meaningless? And I would say no more meaningless than floor action is, right? Floor action is this kind of game in some levels where they kind of give speeches to empty rooms. So why do floor action? Why do debates if it's really not really a debate? It's not really about having the exchange of ideas and moving people intellectually, right? So what would our answer be in both cases? Why do we have debates? Why do we have floor action?
Like we have floor action to be like informative and to be like to at least show that you're making the effort.
So I'm going to spin a little bit what you're saying to show you're making the effort. We're a democracy, and a democracy depends on the open and free exchange of ideas. So we're not really a democracy if we don't hold these debates. And on some level, yes, there is an exchange of ideas. Do the candidates kind of like dodge the questions and answer the things that they want and hit their talking points the way they do? Yeah, but on the same standpoint, they are at least talking about issues. And it is, to a degree, holding them accountable. And I would also argue, is there any substitute for seeing them side by side? Just to kind of, if you want to measure two candidates up, put them on a stage, put them through that kind of difficult ordeal and see how they come out, right? So we would argue that they are, critical for the democratic process. But again, what we boil it down to is who won, who lost. And we even boil it down smaller into a sound bite. So I've used that term multiple times. What is a sound bite? What do you think? What's a sound bite?
Small, piece of information or report.
A little fragment of something that somebody said. So the example the other day, one of the classic ones that got hung around George Herbert Walker Bush's neck was his promise about taxes. Do you remember?
Read my lips.
Read my lips.
New taxes.
And that gets played over and over and over again. And at first it may seem like, okay, that's a, that's a sharp way of kind of saying it that has a ring to it. And I'm for Bush. And then later on when he raises taxes, it gets hung around his neck, right? So a soundbite is often what it comes down to. But sometimes there are more substantive moments in a debate that can maybe be kind of game changers, and that's what we look for. Thought I started to see a hand. All right, so ideally I'd love to take you through all of them. This will be a little imperfect, but I can show you a little bit about what I mean here.
One indisputable truth, debates, well, they can make history.
I've been there now.
September 26, 1960, the first televised presidential debate, signaling a new era where appearances matter more than ever, and gaffes, however small, are magnified.
The goals are the same for all Americans.
John F. Kennedy, a young senator from Massachusetts, facing off against Vice President Richard Nixon, who's known to be a fierce debater. But on screen, Kennedy looks cool and calm, while Nixon looks uncomfortable, sweating profusely under the hot studio lights.
I think I better shave.
Nixon flounders under the glare of television for all four debates. Kennedy goes on to win the election. In 1976, President Gerald Ford makes this blunder in his debate with Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration. I'm sorry, could I just pause?
The remark becomes a central theme in Carter's campaign and is blamed by many for costing Ford the election.
The emphasis.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan was repeatedly attacked by President Carter for his stance on health care.
Governor Reagan, as a matter of fact, began his political career campaigning around this nation against Medicare.
But Reagan wins fans and the election by staying cool.
There you go again.
4 years later, President Reagan again uses humor to handle attacks on his age during his debate with Walter Mondale.
And I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
In the next election, Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis is asked this controversial question in his debate with Vice President George Bush.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life.
The public sees his answer as cold and dispassionate, and that very night his poll numbers drop. During the 1988 vice presidential debate, Republican Senator Dan Quayle's comparison to John F. Kennedy elicits this blistering response from his opponent.
Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
Body language plays a part in the presidential debate in 1992. George H.W. Bush deliberately looks at his watch, and he pays for it when the audience and voters see it as disrespectful.
Here's differences.
Body language makes a difference in the debate between Al Gore and George W. Bush as well. Gore sighs over and over again. And Bush, the underdog, surprises by winning the debate and, of course, the election.
That's what a governor.
Both President Obama and Governor Romney are seasoned debaters, and experts say neither are prone to making major gaffes. But if there is one thing that history's taught us when it comes to presidential debates, expect the unexpected.
So there's tons more that we could show you, but that gives you a sampling of both what a soundbite is. Like that Benston quote to Dan Quayle was, "I knew Jack Kennedy, I served with Jack Kennedy, you sir or no Jack Kennedy." It was a kind of blistering in that sense, and it gets played over and over again. The "there you go again" gets played over and over again. So you do have these kind of where haymakers land, I suppose, and it's seen as like being really kind of like impactful, and that's what caused, we want it simple. So that's what causes this person to win the debate. They had the best zinger. But then again, you look at the numbers and you think, well, did it? Did it matter?
And like also there's a little bit like there's a lot of political theater, like I think back when Trump and Hillary like refused to shake each other's hands.
Yep.
Like at first, I think they did that for the first debate. They shook hands, very like contempt.
Right.
And then you see like it becomes a thing like they don't even like look at each other.
Yeah. So there's there are other points where it felt like just using physical presence on the stage even too. Hillary writes a little bit about feeling like Trump stalked her and was like hovering.
Weird. He kept like walking behind her.
But you see that also with like Mitt Romney invading kind of Obama's space at one point as they got kind of contentious, but it was again kind of posturing. I love McCain because McCain kind of wandered in the background. Saturday Night Live does this great kind of skit on it where McCain's just kind of wandering as they spoof the debates. You'll have to watch that.
Or LBJ's poorly named Johnson treatment.
Yep. And that's not necessarily with the debates, but we'll look at that where that's the whole idea of like winning the debates on some level by appearing bigger and stronger, I suppose. All right, so we come to the final segment, which is if we're running a campaign and we're trying to get a candidate to do well. Hi.
If you change your costume.
Yeah, I did. I also, it took me forever because there's a car parked in my parking spot.
Uh-oh.
Oh, yeah, someone parked in all of our spots.
All right, hold on. You're all going out on the internet with this kind of sidebar about where your cars are. All right. So again, we're going to look at money here, and does money matter? And see if you can do it kind of quickly on the spot. But as we look, kind of the spending, is fairly similar. But you've got Reagan maybe outspending Carter. Fairly equal spending between Reagan and Mondale, Bush and Dukakis. Does Clinton spend more than Bush? Does Clinton spend more than Dole? Does Bush spend more than Gore? So as we get, does Bush spend more than Kerry? Does Obama outspend McCain?
Yes.
As you get, from like, the 80s on, what seems to be the trend? The candidate that spends more wins, right? Is that an aberration or is that, a new norm? Again, one of the things that you see here is how much he spent, but what did I show you?
Free media.
The free media, right? So again, did the candidate that mastered the new technology, the idea of kind of using Twitter to generate both free coverage and paid, not necessarily paid media coverage, but mainstream media coverage. You didn't have to pay him, they just kind of ran what he said. You know, does money win elections, essentially, is what we're debating. Do you see a trend with, you know, the Senate and the House in terms of what incumbents spend versus the challengers? On average, in the House, you need about 1.5 million as an incumbent. In the Senate, you're spending close to 14 million. What you see is a 6-to-1 advantage or a 7-to-1 advantage. Who wins more of the time, incumbents or challengers? Right? A little different, you know, again, you've got a greater incumbency advantage in the House than you do in the Senate. It's a little more volatile, but again, does money win elections? If the numbers aren't enough, what does the American public say about it? And you gotta squint a little bit. I tried to kind of highlight it, but you know, here's a recent poll where we look at the idea of money in politics and how the American public feels about it. And in this instance, 66% that were surveyed responded they felt the wealthy had too much of an influence, and that money has too much of an influence, 84%. And again, these surveys are interesting because if I have the right sampling size and the right demographics within my sampling, I can, you know, fairly reliably extrapolate from that and say that this is reflective of what most Americans believe, that money plays too much of an influence, right? I mean, what percent are really wealthy and can really influence an election? How many of us donate to campaigns? It's a really small amount. So of course, you know, if the top 1 to 5% can afford to influence campaigns, it would stand to reason the rest of us think, hey, money plays too much of a role. That number ought not to be a shock. This one asked, do you think the money gets you influence? And 55% said most of the time. You know, we can debate whether it's access versus influence. You know, hey, you gave me money and now I have to vote a certain way, or do I just have to listen to you and give you an appointment, right? 46% say they want to kind of completely rebuild how we fund elections. 58% are pessimistic about our system, you know, whether or not we're going to kind of achieve those changes. And 77% are in favor of limiting. And yet, you know a little history of the efforts to limit. So, it's quiz time. You're on the spot, you're going to be recorded here, right? Are you this person? Okay? So, we're going to go back through some of the stuff that we've covered. We'll do it one more time with interest groups, and by then it'll really be cemented. Watergate is our kind of Waterloo. Alliteration and symmetry intended, I guess, right? This is where we get really disenchanted with politics, begin to be concerned about trying to introduce reform. You have the Campaign Reform Act of 1971 that's updated in 74. And really the #1 rule of any effort to reform when it comes to money or outside influence is to do what? Do you remember? Do you remember? Very good. Look at this. Look at these special effects. All right, we want to make it transparent, okay? So, that leads to the next question. The effort in 74 in part wants to make things transparent. If you can't do something, you know, under the light of day, if you feel shame and embarrassment, that's a sign, maybe I shouldn't be doing something like this, right? So if you can't do it with the public kind of witnessing it, you probably shouldn't do it. And the Campaign Act of 71/74 will have that in part. What we're also trying to do is, you know, reduce the role that big fat cat, we use that as an analogy, these kind of spoiled cats, the ones that are kind of gluttonous and selfish and all about themselves, right? That terminology is deliberate. We want to reduce the role of the fat cats. How? Do you remember the kind of the 4 steps? What's one, Colin?
I think
okay.
Like just setting limits on like the amount you can donate.
Good. So we kind of have limits to what you can donate directly to the candidate.
And like you have to make yourself public when you do it.
And you make it public, right? So it's part of the public record. Good.
Like off of the public record part, you have to make PACs.
Good. So if I am going to do some spending, you know, I make it transparent by having a donor list for individuals. But what if a corporation or an interest group or a labor group wants to do it? How do I track? I know how to track individuals. How do I track entities, right? And they have to form a PAC, a political action committee, where essentially all it is the political spending arm of a corporation, right? So the NRA has a PAC. The teachers associations have a PAC. Good. So that's a little more specific of how we make it transparent. What else? I'm taking away money in this sense then, if I'm putting ceilings on things. But democracy depends on a free exchange of ideas, so how do I fix that?
It's like a soft money policy.
So again, that's going to be one of the reforms that comes later under the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, because what you're talking about is a loophole that we're going to open up in a second. See why we have to go over it multiple times? It gets confused.
So wait, so like the ad thing, like you can't.
You're down the road too through the loophole. I'm taking money out of the system. I'm putting less money in candidates' hands. So how do I supplement that? Because democracy depends on the free exchange of ideas.
Is there a matching?
There's a matching system, right? And how do I know that everyone's following the rules of all of these things?
To make the FEC.
I've got to make the FEC, I've got to make a watchdog group. So let's see if you got all four, right? So we're going to set limits, we're going to make sure it's public, and then you added the idea of, for entities, it's through PACs. We're going to kind of help supplement the loss of money with the matching system, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. And we're going to monitor it with a watchdog group or agency, the FEC. You know, to kind of look at it, you know, as an individual, you have a ceiling of 2,700, and they will adjust that. This is a 2015-16, they will adjust it. It's called COLA, cost of living adjustments, as, you know, the value of money doesn't stay consistent over time, so eventually you're gonna have to kind of adjust those. I don't think you'll ever get asked these numbers, but I do think that it is valuable to see, because essentially what you see here is I can give to candidates, I can give to a political action committee, I can give to the state or national kind of party, and then there's kind of a lump sum total. And there's different rules for, you know, or dollar amounts in a sense for individuals versus PACs versus, what's interesting is the state, you can give to the state committees, and the state committees in turn can give elsewhere. Isn't that kind of wild? Where they kind of redistribute the money. All right. Again, I don't think you necessarily have to go on this level, but I do think it's interesting to see that the matching system, if we look at it from a dollars and cents standpoint, does it, unintended, make sense? Is it something that you could be viable on? I don't want to give money just to anybody. Again, who's the guy at the grocery store that you guys liked?
I couldn't even tell you his name.
All right, so
I have his business card.
he wants to run, right? Should we be giving him hard-earned federal tax dollars? Well, he'd have to show viability. He would have to essentially raise $5,000 in individual contributions of $250 or less in 20 states minimum. In other words, get 400 people spread out across 20 states to contribute 250 bucks. Okay, that's a kind of a low threshold, don't you think? Once you get that, you don't get like unlimited funds. You get exactly what you raised dollar for dollar, assuming that there's money available. We'll talk about where that money comes from. Just to give you a preview, the money is based on a tax kind of checkoff that you do, where they kind of direct some of your refund or the amount that you have paid in taxes to this special fund. So we have as much money as people have checked off, if that makes sense, right? So you're going to get it dollar for dollar, but not beyond what they have available. So it's not an infinite amount of money.
So, do they each reach 5,000 or 50,000? Because 400 contributing 250 would be 50,000.
Yeah. So again, it's in the 20 states minimum. So extrapolate it from there, as you just did, right? What it's basically saying is the more you're able to raise, the more you get, and that's kind of the formula as well, right? You got any predictions? There is essentially, I'm going to show you it on the form here in a second. There is essentially a little check spot on your tax return forms where you say, do you want $3 going to the presidential fund, right? Remember, do you guys, because you may have done it recently with you guys who were just kind of working for the first time. Did you check the box?
I think they did.
Yeah. What percent of the American public do you think checked it?
Like less than 10.
All right, so I got less than 10. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, what I want you to keep in mind is it's going to say, no, this will not result in any kind of decrease in your return. So in other words, you paid into the system, they are just deciding, does this money go to defense or the National Art Endowment for the Arts or the campaign? It's just about where to direct your tax dollars. You don't get any less back, right? So it's basically asking you, do you want to help publicly finance elections, or do you want inside money to do it? And I got less than 10%. probably not a bad guess. Might be a little lower.
Oh.
But it depends on what time period we're looking at. Okay, I'll show you that in a second. Again, these have ceilings, and what you see in the modern era is that most candidates can raise more independently than is available through the matching system, so it hasn't been used. McCain was the last one to use it. So even though it's kind of good intent, it doesn't seem to work. You know, the money just isn't there that people can raise independently. So to kind of come to our trends here, how many people I said like have donated to a campaign or given money to a candidate or like an interest group? It's less than 1% have that kind of disposable income that they hand to a candidate, right? So, you know, that in many ways makes the impact of big donors even greater because you know, there were 31,000, almost 32,000 donors, equal to 1% of the 1% of total population of the U.S., and yet they accounted for 1.18 billion in the disclosed contributions. In other words, that 1% of 1% represented 30% of the total funds raised. Holy cow, right? Why doesn't the matching system kind of equal it? Well, roughly at this point, we're around 6% that actually checked this box. And if you didn't believe me, checking a box below will not change your tax or refund, right? And yet most of us say, you can't have my money.
The average donation per person, if that math like worked out, would be $36,902.
That's having some disposable income, isn't it? You know?
Just a little bit.
So, all right, before I click, this was the intent to reform. And one of the things that obviously we see a problem with is the matching system doesn't seem to keep up with the you know, the availability of kind of independently raising money. But what really kind of hamstrings the Federal Election Campaign Act? What is, you got Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, Brown v. Board. What is perhaps right up there in terms of level of importance of a case, maybe slightly second tier?
Nixon versus U.S.?
Good guess, and that's important in terms of the scope of executive power, but I'm looking at the thing that guts campaign finance reform.
Well, Gray versus, Baker versus God?
No, because you're doing the one man, one vote.
God damn it.
Vallejo?
Yes, that's the second part.
Something.
Buckley versus Vallejo. What does it say? How does it gut it? What does it equate spending to? Independent spending. Free speech, right?
Bold choice.
Okay. So again, think of it as like a fill-in, right? Here we're essentially saying that campaign expenditures represent a form of speech, provided money is spent independently, right? The whole idea here is I'm using money to express my political opinion by kind of supporting different candidates or organizations or whatever. But I have to do it independently. I have to kind of do it on my own. And if I do it that way, it's free speech. If I'm giving it to the candidate, and see if you can get the irony, who in turn says what I want them to say, well, then I can regulate that one, right? So the only one that often, again, as we go through this kind of bizarre series of cases and things like that, the only one that ever seems to face limits is the candidate themselves, okay? So again, you guys had already kind of gotten into this. Buckley versus Vallejo, he had just kind of identified the wrong Miss Universe. Buckley versus Vallejo opens two loopholes in terms of like independent expenditures. Ways we support a candidate without directly supporting a candidate. So you guys had already mentioned them.
Soft money.
Soft money. What was the other one? Yeah, you started to go with
The
it.
ad thing.
Yeah, what kind of ads?
You can't, issue ads.
Issue ads, right? So what is soft money as opposed to hard money? What am I doing, Colin, with soft money?
It's money spent to not finance the election, help,
Kind of, yeah, I'm giving it to who?
The party.
The party, and the party is doing what in quotes?
Party building.
Party building activities. In other words, things that kind of increase the profile of the party, that build the party and might have a tangential benefit to the candidate. Coincidence, right? What's an issue ad? What's an issue ad? How's that work?
I was gonna say, they're also like get out the vote ads, like not
Yep.
necessarily directed.
So
at-
that's, again, that might be through soft money, that I'm gonna use it to kind of do a get out the vote effort that might include ads. And it again is there to build the party, but it has that tangential benefit. What's an issue ad? You hear it right in it. What is it?
I mean, defining the thing with the thing, but it's based on a certain issue, not a political, like a candidate.
Yeah, so that you've made it different that way by saying what it's not, right? I'm not gonna necessarily directly mention the candidate, I am gonna talk about an issue,
An
but
issue that
again,
candidate may be in support of.
may line up with. So again, it has that tangential benefit. And literally in the footnote of the case, you will find these like dirty words that they have to avoid in order for it to be an issue ad. You can't say vote for, you can't say support, but everything else is kind of fair game.
Can you say vote against?
No, but again, you're gonna see that it almost doesn't matter, because later on, we're just gonna blur the lines of this as well. That by the time we get to like speech now, it's any kind of ad is fair game, as long as, again, it's uncoordinated. That's, the rule that we'll end with, all right? So remember, the contrast to issue advocacy is express advocacy, and it does kind of say those direct things, a vote for, support, vote in favor of, so on and so forth. And again, you've identified soft money versus hard money, and that's the money given directly to a candidate to expressly kind of support them. Let's see if you guys can kind of get the difference here, all right? Here's an issue ad. Let's see how, distinct they are.
Maggie Hassan vetoed a budget that doubled funding to prevent heroin addiction. Hassan's office was unaware of a $12 million grant to fight heroin. And Maggie Hassan's hand-picked drug czar resigned in controversy. Maybe accidents, maybe oversights. It doesn't matter. Maggie Hassan mismanaged the heroin crisis, and New Hampshire is paying the price.
NRSC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
It doesn't say.
Did I say vote for? Did I say vote against?
No.
We're talking about heroin and the opioid epidemic. We just happen to also be talking about Maggie Hassan and her handling of that. That's an issue ad. Does it have
But
a
is
tangential
it-
benefit to the challenger, and does it hurt Maggie Hassan? Yeah, but I can still get around limits that way. Here's something more express.
We've got room to put 2,700 people in our jail. It costs us about $103 a day.
Gerald really doesn't have any hobbies.
Last year's tax rate was 0.4169. This year, we could take that down to 3,838.
So is he always like that? Yeah, all the time.
Which means that the 3,838 is probably going to go somewhere between 3,838 and 41.69.
Most people leave their work at the office.
We got 3 light rail cars. You can put 60 people on each car. So even if you add 2 cars, you're talking about maybe 300 people that are affected. There are 1 million people in this community. I mean, that is 0.01 to the 8th power. If you round it off, it's 0.
All he wants to do is fix things.
So we got this 18-wheeler that's parked in this neighborhood, fumes all over the place, but quite frankly, it's not a code violation. You know, I think I like helping around the house here.
Please re-elect Gerald. Please.
For that alone, you ought to re-elect Gerald. But did it say vote for, essentially, re-elect? It said the words.
Where was that an ad for?
I have to look it up. That was a great one, right? Okay, so I got these loopholes. Let's see about trying to close them with the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. He's just found out he's not the starting quarterback anymore, but then you are again, but you're not. So again, this is also McCain-Feingold. It's another way of describing it based on the co-sponsors. McCain being kind of the maverick that makes these bipartisan kind of agreements and gives yet a second, more confusing name to this. This had 3 provisions, all right? So, nope, I thought I had it as fill-ins here. Don't peek. Okay, so the ceilings aren't working. And so one of the things was the millionaires amendment. Do you remember what that was at all? Yeah, I told you if you held on to Buckley versus Vallejo up to this point, you were okay, right? And that you just hopefully got some of this other stuff. What the Millionaires Amendment essentially says is, let's raise the amount that individuals can contribute in order to compete with the outside money. all right? So we're gonna raise the ceilings of what individuals can give. It seems like counterintuitive, but it actually makes sense. Do you get it? If the small amounts that people are giving isn't keeping up, let's increase the amount you can donate to a candidate, okay? So that's one. What did they say, can you remember what they said about soft money and about how they went about raising it? Did they kind of go nod, nod, wink, wink when they were raising soft money? You know, you give me money for the party, nod, nod, wink, wink, we'll build the party, not the candidate. You know, essentially what they're saying is you can't do these open solicitations of soft money as a way to tell people to kind of get around the campaign limits. Because there was a definite kind of like, you know, everybody knew that's how the money was being used, and they were pretty open and cavalier about it. And then they stopped worrying about election issue ads versus, you know, how do I make the distinction? I did those two ads side by side, an issue ad versus the direct express kind of ad, right? We're just gonna call it anything that is an ad, electioneering communication. And we're gonna begin to not worry about what kind of ad it is, but when it is. And because what happens is the closer you get to a primary or a general election, you get saturated. I don't know if you guys remember particular election cycles where all of a sudden it seemed like everything else was an ad. And really what I want to know is who's running the ad. So what it does is it gives kind of special treatment or bigger hurdle for corporations and labor groups in particular, those PACs who run tons of ads and they don't tell you who you are, right? If you're running any kind of ad and you are within a window of a primary or the general election, you got to tell us who you are. Okay, those are the three provisions. Good? Yeah. Right, because you're going to try to remember, I'm going to give you this as a warm-up tomorrow. You're going to fill those in. So then, yes, Monday. I'll come find you tomorrow. Then along comes Citizen United. All right, and Citizen United is largely looking at the idea of can you limit speech, money as speech, based on the identity of the speaker. Like, can I hold corporations and labor groups to this kind of standard? All right? So what it's going to rule is that corporations and unions have the same free rights of speech as individuals. Companies and corporations are people, right? And therefore they can use what kind of funds? Getting to that, unlimited. They can use unlimited funds to run what kind of ads? Any kind of ads, provided it's not
indirect correlation with the candidate.
Yeah, we basically talk about that as you're not kind of coordinated. You're not coordinated with the candidate. What you do have to do though is disclose your identity. Okay. So again, those are ideally you're not gonna, you know, if you ever had to write it, like there is a question on campaign finance I remember in the past, and it said, you know, essentially describe a reform and like what was its intent and why didn't it work. So you're not always going to get it as a fill-in, but it's good to approach it as this at this point, right? So again, the principle still stays that as long as you're spending it independently, you're free to spend unlimited amounts, and we don't necessarily care what kind of ad, right? Corporations have the same rights as people. You can run any kind of ad as long as it's done independently. The catch, though, is still, wait a minute, there's this hurdle. You have to disclose your identity. So for that, we go to Speech Now. All right? So what we want to look at is, you know, the idea of whether or not they can still anonymously give, you know, their unlimited amounts or not, right? So we want to be able to do our fill-ins here. That the courts, you know, ruled that individuals and corporations are free to, I've got a little hint here, ID, anonymously give what kind of amounts? Unlimited amounts to independent groups, and those would be the ones that are kind of like identified by the tax code. And then those groups can in turn spend the unlimited amounts on any kind of ad with no disclosure. Again, assuming that the spending is independent, is uncoordinated. What I mean by this is a way to launder your kind of spending. You know, under under Citizens United, I have to disclose my identity. With Speech Now, I can essentially find a tax-sheltered kind of entity like 501c4s and donate to a candidate and never have to say, this is who I am, okay? Why would I want to do that? Can you think of controversial candidates?
Yes.
Can you think of how donating to them might kill brand? Right? You know, if I give to this candidate, I'm associated with these kind of policies or this person, and it might kill brand. So this is going to get, once again, the idea of disclosure out of there. The same rule still applies, not coordinated, right? And what it eventually is going to allow for is something called a super PAC, all right? So, again, do I picture you having to distinguish between, you know, a 527, a 501c4, and a super PAC?
Yes.
Could happen, could happen.
It could happen, right? And so we'll try it as a warm-up, but I think it's probably better to kind of look at it this way. You know, a 527 is the way that you get around the spending limits. You know, you have to spend independently, it has to be for an issue ad, and you have to disclose your identity. If I don't want to tell you who I am, I'm going to do a 501c4. And again, I can do unlimited spending. I, you know, have to stick with issue ads again. But I don't have to disclose who I am. It's a way to kind of launder money, in a sense. A super PAC, everything's free, right? I can spend anonymously, unlimited amounts on any kind of ad, no disclosure, right? Provided, the one rule, it's spent what? Independently. So essentially, people had to kind of pick and choose between, you know, identifying who they are and identifying who they aren't. Running an issue ad or running an express ad. Here, the sky's the limit. So, I don't know if I have enough time for this.
They had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads.
The accusations that John Kerry made against the veterans who served in Vietnam was just devastating.
Randomly shot at civilians.
And it hurt me more than any physical wounds I had.
Cut off limbs, blown up bodies.
That was part of the torture, was to sign a statement that you had committed war crimes.
Razed villages in fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan.
John Kerry gave the enemy for free what I and many of my comrades in North Vietnam, in the prison camps, took torture to avoid saying. It demoralized us.
Crimes committed on a day-to-day basis.
He betrayed us in the past. How could we be loyal to him now?
Ravaged the countryside of South Vietnam.
He dishonored his country and, more importantly, the people he served with. He just sold them out.
Swift Boat Veterans for Truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
So this is a 527 ad. This was run essentially as an issue ad by an independent group that did these ads independent of any candidate. And what popped up was the Swift Boat Veterans for Kerry. Same kind of idea. And this kind of characterized that particular race, but then along came the 501c4s, and then along came the super PAC spending. But that's kind of what their ad looks like. Does it look any different than a candidate ad in some level? Right? But it's just spent by outside groups that have no coordination with the candidate. I will play you this one when I have a little more time. And it kind of shows you the 501c4s and what we mean by it. But what I want you guys to kind of see is that outside kind of expenditures, you know, are in many ways rivaling or exceeding what the candidate themselves is able to spend. That's what this kind of graphic shows you. That this is how much, you know, in Pennsylvania, this representative spent, or I think it's Senate, look at the amount raised outside. You know, the candidate themselves spend about 20 million, but 116 million was spent on the race independently. There are people that are spending 5 times as much as the candidate telling you what the candidate is about. You get it? You know, and it's all money that pours in from outside sources. You know, here's based on the numbers, I think, House. Candidate themselves spends about 2 million, outside spending is about 15 million, right? And a lot of it is this dark money that we'll talk about, okay? So I've largely wrapped up. How many of us are in striking distance with the study guide? Because the other stuff comes. So I want to see, my expectation is we're done on Monday, or you've got a good sob story for me, right? All right, bye Charlie.
Bye, Charlie.